courtroom was tense as the arguments unfolded. At the front of the room, the imposing figure of Judge Clarence Thomas sat in his black robe, his hands firmly gripping the edges of his bench. His reputation preceded him. He had served on the United States Supreme Court for decades, known for his staunch conservatism and unwavering commitment to interpreting the law through a strict lens. On this particular day, however, it was not the high-profile cases of national significance that had brought him to the courtroom. Instead, he was presiding over a lower court matter that seemed, on the surface, to be just another routine legal proceeding. But for Jasmine Crockett, an up-and-coming lawyer with a reputation for challenging the status quo, it was far from ordinary. Jasmine stood before the judge with the confidence that only comes from a deep belief in one's convictions. She was young, perhaps not yet widely recognized in legal circles, but she had already proven herself to be a formidable presence in the courtroom. With each word she spoke, she exuded a calm, measured defiance, a stark contrast to the intimidating figure of Clarence Thomas sitting just a few feet away. Today, she was representing a group of citizens who believed that a new state law, one which restricted certain civil liberties, was unconstitutional. The case had already stirred up debate in legal circles, and Jasmine had been chosen to argue it before the court. The weight of her responsibility was not lost on her, but she had never been one to shy away from a challenge. Her voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the room as she explained how the law in question violated constitutional protections. She cited precedent, pulling from years of legal scholarship and history, making a compelling case that the law not only overstepped its bounds, but undermined the very freedoms the nation was founded upon. The audience in the gallery, a mix of legal professionals and citizens interested in the case, leaned in, hanging on every word. They knew this was not just about one law, it was about something far bigger, the fundamental principles of justice that governed the nation. Judge Thomas, however, was not as captivated. He sat back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Jasmine, but with a look that suggested a quiet irritation. His expression was inscrutable, a familiar mask that had become a trademark over the years. Thomas was a man who had spent a lifetime in law, and though his career was built on his belief in the strict interpretation of the Constitution, he had often been criticized for his reluctance to engage in public discourse. It was clear from his demeanor that he did not share Jasmine's enthusiasm for the case she was presenting. "Ms. Crockett," he interjected sharply, his voice low but firm, "your arguments, though eloquent, seem to overlook the plain meaning of the law. You suggest that the intent behind this legislation is unconstitutional, but you fail to recognize that it was crafted with the people's will in mind. Your interpretation is flawed." Jasmine paused, taking a breath. She had anticipated the pushback from Judge Thomas. His judicial philosophy had often clashed with more progressive arguments, and this case was no exception. But there was a subtle underlying tension that filled the air. Thomas, a figure revered for his intellectual rigor, was not someone to be easily dismissed. His words carried weight. He had seen decades of legal battles, and he had made decisions that had shaped the course of history. But Jasmine had something he could not ignore, the power of her conviction. "You may be correct, Your Honor," she said, her tone respectful yet defiant. "But even laws crafted by the will of the people can still violate the Constitution. History has shown us that time and time again. The people's will does not trump our fundamental rights. These rights are what protect us from the tyranny of the majority." The words hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed as though the room itself held its breath. Thomas's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward slightly. His gaze did not waver. "Perhaps you misunderstand the role of this court," he said, his voice a little sterner now. "The law is the law, Ms. Crockett. It is not our place to impose personal beliefs about what is right or wrong. Your argument is an emotional appeal, not a legal one." Jasmine remained unfazed. She had heard this before, this argument that the law was an inflexible entity, immune to personal interpretation or emotional pleas. But she believed deeply that the law was not meant to be an instrument of oppression, but one of liberation. She had seen too many lives affected by laws that were unjust, too many voices silenced by the same rigid logic that Clarence Thomas was espousing. And she wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Each word she spoke seemed to chip away at the fortress Thomas had built around his judicial philosophy. He was a man of principle, but principles, she believed, could be dangerous if they were not tempered with empathy, with a sense of what was truly just. Jasmine Crockett had long known that to challenge someone like Judge Clarence Thomas was no small feat. He was a titan in the legal world, a figure whose very name commanded respect and reverence. His conservative views and rigid interpretations of the Constitution had shaped the judicial landscape for decades. He was a man whose influence stretched far beyond the walls of the courtroom, and to stand before him, challenging his beliefs, was a monumental act of courage. But Jasmine had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when the stakes were as high as they were in this case. As the tension in the room mounted, Jasmine remained unwavering. Her voice was steady, each argument she made cutting through the atmosphere like a scalpel. She was fighting not just for her clients, but for a principle that she believed was worth every ounce of her energy. The idea that the law, while vital, could be a tool for both good and evil. The law was not meant to be used as a blunt instrument, to silence voices of dissent, or to impose policies that stripped away fundamental rights. It was supposed to be a shield for the people, not a weapon wielded by those in power. Judge Thomas, however, was unmoved. His gaze was cold, his expression unreadable. As he listened to Jasmine, there was a flicker of annoyance in his eyes, but he said nothing. He had seen young attorneys like her before, passionate, idealistic, and eager to make their mark on the world. But passion alone, he believed, was not enough. The law was clear, and it was his job to uphold it without the influence of personal emotion. To him, the Constitution was sacrosanct, and any deviation from its strict interpretation was an affront to the very fabric of the legal system. But then something happened that none of them expected. As Jasmine continued to argue her case, her words becoming more forceful with every passing moment, she saw the slight shift in Judge Thomas's posture. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable. A tension in his shoulders, a brief pause before he spoke. He had not anticipated the depth of her conviction, the sheer force of her belief in the righteousness of her cause. Jasmine wasn't simply arguing the law, she was challenging him, questioning his worldview in a way that no one had dared to do in years. His voice broke the silence with a sharpness that cut through the air. "Ms. Crockett," he said, his tone icy and authoritative, "you seem to believe that the law is some sort of moral compass that should bend to the whims of every individual who walks through this courtroom. That is not how this system works." Jasmine stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the law is not some cold, unfeeling entity. It is a living, breathing thing, shaped by the experiences and struggles of the people it is meant to serve. To say that it cannot evolve is to deny the very essence of justice." The courtroom was silent, every eye now trained on the exchange between the two. It was not just a legal battle, it was a philosophical clash, an ideological war between the rigidity of Judge Thomas's interpretation and the fluid, evolving perspective that Jasmine represented. But it wasn't just the case at hand that was on trial. It was something deeper, something far more personal to both of them. Thomas had spent years building his legacy on the idea that the law was an unyielding structure, an immovable force that existed outside the realm of emotion, opinion, or changing societal norms. He saw himself as a defender of this rigidity, a protector of the system that had served the nation for centuries. To him, Jasmine's arguments were nothing more than the idealistic ramblings of someone who had yet to understand the true weight of the law. She was challenging the very foundation of his career, and in doing so, she was challenging him as a man, as a judge. "Your Honor," Jasmine said, her voice still calm but with an edge of determination, "the law was not created to oppress or to serve the interests of the few, It was meant to protect the rights of all citizens. The moment we allow it to be used as a tool of injustice is the moment we lose sight of what the law is truly about. Judge Thomas's eyes narrowed. He had been unmoved by her words up until now, but something in her final statement struck a chord deep within him. He was a man who had long prided himself on his unshakable principles, but what Jasmine was saying was not easily dismissed. It wasn't just an intellectual argument, it was a moral one. And that, he realized, was something far more difficult to ignore. For the first time in the hearing, Judge Thomas felt a flicker of doubt. It wasn't that he suddenly disagreed with her. Rather, it was the unsettling realization that he had not truly considered the implications of his own stance. He had been so focused on maintaining the rigidity of the law that he had not stopped to think about its impact on the people it was supposed to serve. And that thought, unsettling and uncomfortable, began to gnaw at him. He had always believed that the law should be above reproach, but Jasmine had forced him to ask himself whether that was always true. The courtroom, still holding its breath, awaited what would happen next. It was clear that this was no ordinary exchange. This was a moment that would shape not just the outcome of the case, but possibly the trajectory of Thomas's own views on the law. As Jasmine Crockett stood her ground, her words growing sharper with each argument, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Judge Clarence Thomas, a man known for his ironclad beliefs and authoritative presence, was no longer the imposing figure who had entered the room with absolute confidence. Something had changed. His calm, stoic demeanor began to crack, and a hint of unease surfaced in his expression. He had expected to dismiss Jasmine's challenge, to uphold his rigid interpretation of the law, and remind her of her place, but now he found himself questioning whether he had been too hasty in his judgment. Jasmine had not only presented her case with precision, but had done something that few people ever dared to do. She had made him reflect on his own principles. The law was his life's work, and for years he had adhered to a strict interpretation of it, believing that any deviation from its original meaning would be a step toward chaos. But as Jasmine spoke with unwavering conviction, she forced him to confront a thought he had long buried. Could the law, even in its most sacred form, sometimes lead to injustice? Was it possible that in his desire to protect its integrity, he had overlooked its potential to harm? For a moment, Thomas considered her words, not just from a legal standpoint, but from a personal one. He had always prided himself on his unflinching adherence to the law, his belief that it was the bedrock of society. But now, standing before him was an attorney who had challenged that belief in a way that was impossible to ignore. Jasmine was not simply arguing for her clients. She was making a statement about the nature of the law itself, about the responsibility those in power had to use it as a tool for fairness, not oppression. His gaze softened, though only slightly, as he looked at her. The certainty that had once driven him seemed to waver, replaced by a subtle recognition that perhaps his worldview had been too narrow, too inflexible. Judge Thomas had spent a lifetime shaping the legal landscape, with a clear-cut vision of right and wrong, of order and justice. But in this moment, with Jasmine's steady resolve staring him down, he began to realize that the law could never be as simple as he had once believed. There were gray areas, nuances that required a deeper understanding, and perhaps he had failed to appreciate them. The gavel remained in his hand, but his grip loosened. For the first time in years, Judge Clarence Thomas found himself rethinking the foundations of his own decisions. The silence that filled the courtroom after Judge Clarence Thomas's reluctant command to release Jasmine Crockett was deafening. It was a rare moment of vulnerability for a man who had spent decades cultivating an image of unshakable authority. Thomas, a figure long revered for his steadfast commitment to the law, had just shown a crack in his armor, something that no one, least of all Jasmine, had anticipated. As the officers stepped back and Jasmine stood tall, free once again, the weight of what had transpired hung heavily in the air. The room was in disbelief. For a moment it seemed as if the world had stopped turning. Here was a woman, a young attorney, who had not only withstood the full force of one of the most powerful, figures in the judiciary, but had also forced him to confront his own convictions. The decision to release her wasn't just a legal one, it was personal. For Judge Thomas, it was a profound realization that he had allowed his pride and rigid interpretation of the law to cloud his judgment. He had acted out of reflex, trying to assert control, but Jasmine's unyielding belief in justice had pierced through that defensive armor. For Jasmine, it was a quiet victory. She had come into this courtroom expecting a battle, but she had never imagined that it would unfold in such an unexpected way. Her heart raced as she stepped away from the officers, her mind still processing the gravity of what had just occurred. In a single pivotal moment, she had not only prevented an unjust punishment but had also forced one of the most respected judges in the country to question his own principles. The legal world would undoubtedly take note of this moment. Jasmine Crockett had taken on a giant and emerged victorious. As the room slowly returned to its normal rhythm, Thomas remained seated, his gaze never leaving Jasmine. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, no triumph. Instead, there was something far more unsettling: regret. The realization that he had almost made a grave error, that his authority had been challenged in a way that was both humbling and necessary, began to sink in. He had spent his career building a legacy on a certain belief about the law, but today Jasmine had forced him to see that even the strongest convictions could be flawed. Though the case would continue, and though Thomas would surely try to reassert his authority in future hearings, something had shifted. He had been reminded of the very thing that made the law more than just a set of rules: its humanity. In his pursuit of justice, Thomas had almost forgotten that the law was not an abstract concept, but something that had real-world consequences for those who stood before him. And Jasmine had reminded him of that in the most unexpected way possible. The aftermath of that courtroom encounter reverberated far beyond the walls of the legal institution. For Judge Clarence Thomas, the experience had been nothing short of a revelation. As a man who had spent his life meticulously upholding a strict interpretation of the law, he had rarely, if ever, been forced to question his own approach. His decisions, his rulings, had always been driven by the unyielding belief that the law was an absolute, that its meaning could not be swayed by emotion or personal conviction. But Jasmine Crockett, with her resolute passion and her unwavering commitment to justice, had delivered a lesson that he could not ignore. It was a reminder that the law, while a cornerstone of society, was not infallible. It was a tool, not a weapon, and like any tool, it could be used for both good and ill. The moment Jasmine stood tall, freed from the threat of contempt, was not just a victory for her. It was a moment of transformation for Thomas. His entire worldview had been shaken. He had expected to silence her, to assert his authority, but instead he had been forced to reckon with the deeper implications of his own power. He had sought to maintain control, to reinforce his unbending view of the law. But in doing so, he had nearly trampled on the very principles he had sworn to uphold. In that brief but charged moment, he had glimpsed the human cost of legal decisions, and it unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. For Jasmine, the victory was both personal and professional. It was a testament to her belief in the law's potential to serve justice, not just in its strict form, but in its ability to evolve and adapt to the needs of the people it was meant to protect. She had faced down a powerful adversary, not with defiance but with the strength of her convictions. In doing so, she had not only won the case for her clients, but had also sparked a conversation that would extend far beyond the courtroom. Her courage had forced an undeniable figure like Clarence Thomas to reconsider his stance, to question the rigidity that had defined his judicial philosophy for so long. She had reminded him and the world that the law was not just about following rules but about serving humanity. The news of the case and its dramatic outcome spread quickly, fueling debates across legal circles, political platforms, and public discourse. For Thomas, it was a humbling moment. It wasn't about the case itself or the ruling. It was about the realization that, as much as he had tried to hold on to a singular interpretation of the law, it was the human element of justice that mattered most. For Jasmine, it was the beginning of a new chapter in her career, one that would undoubtedly see her rise to greater heights. She had not only fought for the rights of her clients, but had also taken on one of the most formidable figures in American law and won. In the end, what had started as a courtroom clash between a seasoned judge and a rising attorney had turned into a transformative moment for both. Clarence Thomas, for all his years of experience, had been reminded that the law, at its core, was about more than rules. It was about people. And Jasmine Crockett, with her bold spirit and unwavering sense of justice, had reminded him that even the most steadfast convictions could be challenged when they no longer served the greater good. It was a moment that would go down in history, not just as a legal victory, but as a testament to the power of courage, conviction, and the willingness to question authority in the pursuit of true justice.